Last year, or possibly the year before, I decided to start making a skirt out of this pretty Liberty print fabric. I made the skirt but wasn't massively happy with it, so ended up abandoning it. I think that the cotton print is inspired by the 16th century embroidery. Having decided that now it was June, I probably ought to start wearing some slightly more summery skirts, I decided to re-excavate the skirt. I didn't have any clue as to what the different pieces were to begin with, so I decided to start by ironing it to see whether I could make head or tail of what it all was. Having ironed both of the top fabric and the lining, I laid it out on the floor to try and establish how on earth it all went together. It seems that I'd hand sewn some bits of piecing onto it so that it would use less fabric, because Liberty print fabrics are, funnily enough, rather expensive. Then it was a question of pinning the seams together, and then sewing it all together, both the lining and the top fabric. I did this by machine on account of the fact that it's June, I need a summer skirt, and I don't have the time or the energy or the inclination to hand sew the entire thing. Having sewn the straight stitch, I then decided to do a zigzag stitch to neaten it so that hopefully it will last longer and won't fray as easily. Unfortunately, I didn't then trim the seams all the way to the zigzag stitch before finishing sewing the skirt together, so I probably ought to correct that at some point. I sewed the lining together in much the same way that I did the print, except it didn't have the piecing in it. Once I'd sewn it together, I decided that it was probably best to leave the lining hanging free like a petticoat, and so therefore it'd be better if it was cut slightly shorter. I measured it out with a metal tape measure because I'm afraid I've completely lost my fabric tape measure and I don't know where it's gone. This is a bit of a running theme, isn't it? Then I cut off the bottom of the petticoat bit so that it was shorter and not as visible underneath the top fabric. In a slightly misguided attempt at efficiency, I decided to do a scalloped edge rather than rolling and pinning a hem and then sewing it on the machine. Funnily enough, it wasn't actually quicker in the long run because I ended up having to spend an entire afternoon cutting around all of the little scallops. But never mind, I won't be making this mistake again. Probably. Having essentially finished the underskirt, I pinned together the top fabric and the underskirt at the waistline and then sewed them together so that they wouldn't be slipping and sliding all over the place when I pinned them into the waistband. The waistband was already made, pretty much. It was finished with buttonholes and buttons on when I dug this out of the bag that I'd left it in. I then decided to hand sew the waistband onto the skirt rather than to machine sew it, on the grounds that I'm neater at hand sewing than machine sewing. I'm quite messy on a sewing machine. It took a while to hand sew the waistband, but I think it was worth it in the long run. I then hemmed with a whip stitch one of the sides of the opening of the skirt. It was meant to have a zip in it, but I have no idea where the zip ended up, so I'm going to have to improvise something else. And then, in another misguided attempt at I'm not quite sure what, I decided to hand hem the entire hem of the top fabric, which took another whole afternoon. So this wasn't really as quick a project as I intended it to be, but never mind. It's quite nice because you can't really see the stitching for the hem on the right side of the top fabric. For the back fastening, I decided to cut out a placket of some matching fabric because the zip still hadn't turned up, so I measured it very exactly with the opening of the skirt, cut it out, and then sewed it inside out on the sewing machine. Once sewn, it was then a case of turning it inside out and making sure that all of the corners were properly turned out and pointy. And then a question of pinning it to and then hand sewing it to the other side of the opening. I hand sewed it, which probably wasn't the quickest of things to do, but it was definitely neater than sewing it by machine because I was able to go slower and more carefully. Having finished sewing the placket on, I then essentially had a wearable skirt, if you don't mind the couple of back bits being pinned together as well as the buttons, on account of the fact that I haven't decided what to do with hooks and eyes or buttons or something yet. But anyway, I really like this skirt. It's lovely and light and cool and floaty, and it hangs really well. And it's slightly Tudor inspired as well, which is always good.